Hi, now we're on to, yay, our last chapter. This is chapter 13, Fine Arts, Media, Architecture, Part 2. So in the last part of the chapter, we were talking about columns, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. And they're really great because they opened up the space and they would hold up the ceiling and they let in more light. But the problem was, in order to hold up the ceiling, you had to have a bunch of them. So what this did, and here's like an aerial view, it's called an elevated view of the Parthenon, and you see that there's like a million columns. All these circles are columns. So what columns did was, unfortunately, they limited the size of usable space. So this will lead us to something that eventually, in part, helps solve that problem. So arches have been around for a really long time. The Egyptians used them, Babylonians, Greeks, I'm sure other cultures did. And at that time, like years and years and years ago, because they were made out of stones or bricks, they could only be used in small storage buildings or underground drainage systems. The disadvantage of them was you could only make them so tall. You could only make them so wide, otherwise they would collapse. And you were having to use these really heavy materials, like that load-bearing construction we were talking about, in order to construct them. So the Romans, they had an innovation that was concrete. It's not exactly the same as concrete we use, and we'll talk about it more later, but it was concrete. And the great thing about it is it was really strong. It could be poured into molds. It was cheaper than carving stone. And if you made an arch, this is called a Roman or rounded arch, out of concrete, they were stronger, so you could make them taller and wider. You could span great distances. Here's an example. So like each one of these little blocks, bossuers in the Roman arch would be like molded, like poured into a mold. And then there's a keystone at the top, and the pressure runs down through these vertical supports and into the ground. Like one example that really shows the great distances and the great importance of the arch are things known as aqueducts. This is the Pont de Gard aqueduct bridge in France. And this was built by the Romans because they colonized all over this area. And what it did was it transport water from one place that had water to another place that didn't have water. So there's a little town named Nimes, and Nimes didn't have a natural water source. So they would build these aqueducts, and they always had to be built kind of like at an angle so the water would flow down them. And they traveled, this particular one traveled 31 miles to bring 8,800,000 gallons a day to the city. And it provided water for their fountains, their baths, their homes. Yes, the Romans had pipes, they had plumbing, but it was made out of lead. Not a good idea. So this water that would run through this aqueduct, which, by the way, occasionally the aqueducts would have to span over rivers and stuff. So there would be like a walkway or a bridge that people in carts could go across on, and the aqueduct part is up here where the water's flowing. So then once the water reached the city, it would be stored in a cistern. This is not in Nimes, this is in Istanbul. And there's a cistern in Houston. I've never been, and I'm kicking myself because it's supposed to be really amazing. And they do art installations and sound installations in the cistern, which is somewhere downtown. So the bridge over Buffalo Bayou near UHD, there's a Roman arch, and it goes across the bayou. So you can see like it's made out of concrete, and it's spanning the distance of the bayou. When you take two Roman arches and you connect them, you get what's known as a barrel vault. And again, the Romans didn't invent this, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greek, they were using these, and they would make these little storage areas or tombs or these drainage systems. And the problem when you're making a barrel vault, especially out of the materials they were using, so the Romans were using concrete, and so again, it kind of made it a little difficult to have the sides of that support itself. So if you're doing a building, you had to add on these things called buttresses that would help that barrel vault from splaying out. The issue with making a building using barrel vaults is, although it's going to let in light on either end, it's going to be dark in the middle. So the Romans, they were like, well, what if we intersected two barrel vaults? And this, when you do that, you create what's known as a groin vault. And the great thing about a groin vault, it doesn't use as much materials as a barrel vault. You're not having to put buttresses there. It lets in more light, and it's stronger because, you know, like, think about if you had an animal that only had two legs and then its front of it fell down, or unless you're a person. But this has four legs, so it's sturdier and stronger. That was a terrible analogy. So a place that used both barrel vaults and groin vaults was the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was, this is why it's called the Colosseum, is because the Emperor Nero had this giant statue of himself made. The statue was apparently made out of gold, and everyone called this giant statue Colosso, like Colossus. So they named the Colosseum after him. The Colosseum, like I was saying a while ago, has both barrel vaults and groin vaults. And when you make a groin vault, it does something to the ceiling that we'll look at later. That's called like it's ribbed, and we'll talk about that later. So the Colosseum obviously didn't look like this at the time. It was functioning during the Roman times, during the period when Nero was alive and beyond. It had a floor, and the floor was covered in sand, and the word sand means arena. That's where we get our term arena from. The Colosseum was like you could buy tickets, you could buy concessions like beer and who knows what else. And in the Colosseum, like when it was hot, they had a big blue awning with stars painted on it that went over the roof of the Colosseum. If you were poor, you had to sit way up in the nosebleed seats. Whenever I used to go to the Astrodome, or that was back in the day, I could never afford a good seat, so I would always be sitting up in the nosebleed section. If you were rich, you had these box seats, just exactly like we do today. at the Colosseum, they would have chariot races. They would have like fights to the death between gladiators and gladiators, or gladiators and wild animals. Sometimes they would flood the floor and stage these like battles between ships where people would actually get killed in them. Below the arena, below the floor of the Colosseum, that's where they, this is where the animal cages were, and this is where the gladiators and slaves were held, like also in cages. And then I saw this special not too long ago on PBS where the Romans invented kind of like these almost like dumb waiters where they could put the animal in it and then pull it, like do these pulleys and pull it up where it would like pop up on the arena floor and come out, and then the door of it would like fall back down so it's like there's not a big hole in the floor. What a beautiful explanation. Okay, so there's Bear Vaults in Houston. This is the Co-Cathedral of the Sacred Heart in downtown Houston. Again, I'm mentioning these because you're going to go on a scavenger hunt. That's your last project. This is on St. Joseph Street Parkway between Fannin and San Jacinto. There's also groin vaults in Houston. I know there's one off the light rail. It's like Maine, and I think it's like Capitol or something, and I forget the name of the place. But when you make a groin vault, you get these, they also call them rib vaults. You get these ribs in the ceiling from intersecting the two barrel vaults. These are painted churches in Fredericksburg that have groin vaults. So in around 100 AD, a Roman architect creates a dome. I don't know if this is how he created it. This is what I read in the Sayre book, is that he took a Roman arch and he rotated it 360 degrees. I'm just going to say this like the Romans did not invent the dome. But what they did was they used concrete to make domes so they could make them bigger and like cover wider distances. So the building we're going to talk about in a minute is this building right here. This is the Pantheon. So domes are really great because the walls of the building can support the dome, and the dome is the roof, and now you don't need a bunch of columns to hold it up. So instead of having a really narrow space like this, instead you have this big open space, and this is the interior of the Pantheon. The Pantheon was it means all the gods. It's like a place where the worship of all the gods takes place. So this was commissioned by the Emperor Marcus Agrippa in 31 BC, and then Hadrian, who we've learned about before, is Spanish, loved everything Greek, although he lived in Rome, and they called him the Greekling. This was rebuilt for him. The space across here was 142 feet across, and the Pantheon is the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. We use reinforced concrete that has steel bars in it. The Roman, those still hadn't been invented yet, so the Romans did not use steel bars in their concrete. So since the 7th century, this has been a Catholic church. The Pantheon, if we look here, we see this dome and we see this hole in it. And the Pantheon, the hole is called an oculus. The hole is there for structural purposes, which we'll learn about in a minute, but it also let in the heavenly light, let in sunlight, kind of acts like a clock, a sundial, as the sun moves around the sky. It released heat, like heat rises and went up through the hole, so the building stayed cool. And it let in rain, which doesn't sound like such a great thing, but there was a drain right below this on the floor. This dome is made out of concrete, and so solid concrete would be way too heavy to build this structure. So the Romans figure out how to solve this problem, and this is what they do. They cough. Sorry, I just drank some water and went down the wrong tube. So they make the walls of the building really thick. They make them 20 to 25 feet thick. And then they do the series of concrete rings. I think there's 7 of them here. And each ring is constructed of these coffers. These coffers, instead of using like a solid piece of concrete, they made the molds so that these coffers are recessed in the middle. So you're using less concrete, but it's still strong. And then when they're making the concrete, they like concrete will have like pebbles or in it. And what they did was as the rings rose up, they gradually used smaller and smaller rocks in it. And then when they got to the compression ring at the top, so that it wouldn't be too heavy, but would serve its purpose, they kind of broke up pottery and stuff, clay pottery, instead of using rocks in it. And this compression ring, which is right on top of those other rings, it serves the purpose of holding down all the other rings, and the hole and where the oculus is, if that hole wasn't there, for some reason, I don't quite understand it, but it wouldn't be structurally stable if there was no hole. I guess it's too heavy or something. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. So like I said, there's other domes around the world. Like a really important one is the Dome of the Rock, or the Kubbat al-Sakhar in Jerusalem. This was made by Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, and it's sacred to Muslims, Jews, and Christians. That started out the site, like first there was a Roman temple dedicated to Jupiter. Then there was Solomon's temple. Then there was King Herod's temple was there. This is believed to be the place where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. And it's also the place where it is believed that the prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. There's a rock inside of this, in the center of this building, which is the rock where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac, and the rock from which Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven from. In Houston, I mean, there's probably more than just these domes, but there's the Astor Dome. There's the Harris County, there's 2 different Harris County courthouses. This is the historic Harris County courthouse. We talked about this when we were talking about different kind of columns. There's a dome. If they let you go inside of there, there's stained glass too. And also the Harris County Civil Justice Center on Caroline Street has a dome. So we talked about barrel vaults, and we talked about groin vaults and Roman arches. And much earlier in the semester, chapter 5, we talked about Gothic arches. Gothic arches are pointed. Oh my gosh, they're pointed. They have an advantage over Roman arches, and they rise up higher, and they let in more light, and they require less materials, and you don't have to use as thick of columns, and they create less thrust and stress on the surrounding masonry. So the use of Gothic arches led to people more frequently using stained glass. And they also, people started, like with these Gothic arches, which also kind of helped the stained glass from like being too heavy and falling out. They started using this internal tracery. This is tracery here, which a lot of times consisted of smaller arches within the larger shape. So the use of glass was discovered a long time ago in 6th century Mesopotamia, and then the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and the Romans made colored glass beads and objects, and their glass that they were using was not transparent, like later stained glass was. In the Egyptians even had like glass factories. In the 1st century AD, wealthy Romans started using stained glass in their homes. Glass was really, really expensive back then. This is the oldest known surviving stained glass, although I just heard on the news a couple of days ago that in England, in Canterbury, they discovered that some of the stained glass in there was like earlier than this, even a little bit earlier than this. So in the 10th century, people started more frequently using stained glass in churches. This is around, or just probably should say the 11th century, around the Gothic period, where there was more frequent use of those Gothic arches, and that allowed for that stained glass. So stained glass is, the reason it's called that is because on the back side, the side that faces the street, a silver stain is applied to the outside of the window, and that turns yellow when the glass is fired at this really high heat of 3,000 degrees. The glass on the interior side is painted. I know that they make stained glass in different colors now, but the stained glass used to be painted. And stained glass is considered a form of painting. Glass, like I said this before, it was incredibly expensive, and only the very, very wealthy could afford to use glass. The same goes for mirrors. Mirrors were so expensive to make that a regular person couldn't afford them. So a lot of the stained glass got destroyed during the Protestant Reformation. Stained glass and other figurative works. This is what we talked about this previously, the iconoclasts and the iconodults. The iconodults were people that loved paintings and stained glass and statues of saints and Jesus and Mary. And the iconoclasts were the Protestants who thought that they were sinful, and so during the Reformation, the Protestants just started destroying all of the stuff, and the only reason some of it still exists is because the people in the Catholic churches hid it so it wouldn't be destroyed. So apparently, God, I wish I could go there. The most beautiful stained glass in the world is in Turkey at the Topkapi Palace, and this was a palace created for Mehmet the Conqueror. A few years after Istanbul was captured, and Mehmet Sultan Mehmet got the best stonemasons, carpenters, craftsmen from all over the known world to construct this palace. And this, for probably, I don't know, centuries, this was the main residence of the Ottoman sultans. So lots of places in Houston have stained glass. The ones that are near downtown are the Christ Church Cathedral, the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, and also if they allow you to go into the historic Harris County Courthouse, there's a stained glass in the dome. So now we're going to move on to some materials that made buildings structurally even more sound. And the first one we're going to talk about is iron. And this was first used in a building 1796 in the Ditterton Flax Factory. It replaced wood because in some ways it was less flammable. Like buildings were burning down all the time, especially those that had like thatch roofs or wooden structures. So iron, it's made like they heat up iron ore, coke, sinter, and limestone, and it's relatively lightweight. It's very strong in compression, so it'll hold up roofs. It allows for taller and slimmer buildings. And it was cheap. It could be mass produced. There's a couple of ways that they make iron. So one way is cast iron. They liquefy it and then they pour it into molds. This is made from cast iron. This is made from cast iron. And wrought iron, on the other hand, is heated and then manipulated in the shape with tools while the iron is still hot. So the most famous, I wish I could see my little pictures here in the way. Here it is. The most famous wrought iron building in the world is the Eiffel Tower. This is built by the architect Gustav Eiffel and his company. It's built in 1889, and it's made out of 18,000 pieces of wrought iron. So you have to imagine that people by hand made every single one of these pieces of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower was it was awarded a competition. So the competition was to build a monument for the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. This is the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution. So just like Maya Lin was part of competition where people submit designs for something, Eiffel and other people submitted designs. And one of the designs that fortunately did not make the cut was somebody designed a giant guillotine, and that was supposed to like celebrate the French Revolution. Hopefully it didn't work. So the Eiffel Tower instead was awarded the prize. And the Eiffel Tower, like, it had some of the first elevators ever made. It had a restaurant. The elevators broke all the time, by the way. When they started building it, like Parisians were just like, that's the ugliest thing. I can't do the accent. That's ugly blot in the sky. And they were just like, it's horrifying. I hate it. I don't ever want to see it. It's going to ruin the Paris skyline. And like one really famous writer, Guy Maupassant, every day he ate lunch in the restaurant, as I guess it was every day that the elevator worked. He ate lunch in the restaurant. And the reason why, in the Eiffel Tower, the reason why he did is so that when he looked out on Paris, he didn't see the Eiffel Tower. And he said, it's kind of funny. I mean, like, stuff annoys me, but not enough to leave town. I left Paris and even France because in the end, the Eiffel Tower annoyed me too much. Not only could you see it from wherever you went in the city, but you also found it everywhere, made in every material known to man, on sale in all the shop windows, an unavoidable and agonizing nightmare. Well, you know, quit being so angry, buddy. So we have examples of cast and wrought iron in Houston. Just down the street from U of H, this is Main Street, this is Texas, are the post-rise lofts. And these little miniature columns, and this is all made out of cast iron. You might be able to find wrought iron. I don't have an example here. You might be able to find it, but like, make sure that it is and don't just say it is. So in the late 1800s in the United States, this is where we're going to talk about Chicago, but happened in New York and other places. There was an incredible increase in immigration and population growth. So there's a couple of things going on. There's a great migration where African Americans living in the South move up north to cities like they moved to New York and Chicago and Los Angeles in hope that people won't be as racist, and in hope that they can find jobs. Their hopes did not always come true. And they also, there was like an increase in the number of Irish people, Italian people, German people, Polish people were immigrating to the United States, so that there's like population explosion. And this population explosion means that they got to find more places for people to live. So the solution was, in order to make taller buildings, was to use reinforced concrete that had been reinforced with iron to create skyscrapers. So I want you to know that when we're talking about skyscrapers here in this context, these are only buildings that are, at this time, 8 to 10 stories high. So here's an example of that population explosion. Chicago, 1860. This is before the Civil War. Population of 100,000 people. 1880, the population exploded to 1 million people plus. Something else that led to the need for more buildings was there was a great fire in Chicago in 1871, and it just like the buildings were made out of wood, and it ripped through the city and destroyed a ton of buildings. So, so this is another reason why they needed more buildings, but taller buildings. So the first skyscraper ever was a home insurance building in Chicago. Look, I say it twice. And it was built in 1885. And the architect was a guy named William LeBaron Jenney. This building, if I remember correctly, is like 10 stories high. There was no air conditioning at the time, so they had to have lots and lots of windows. So Jenney, he developed something known as skin and skeleton construction. One day he's at home. They have like a wrought iron bird cage. And his wife puts a stack of books on top of it. And Jenney notices that, oh man, it didn't collapse because that's a ton of books. So he uses this as his inspiration. So he develops this construction technique called skin and skeleton. So the skeleton, initially, it's this frame. This initially was made out of cast iron, and then later steel. Now steel is used for the skeleton support system. And then placed on the exterior, this is a skin, which is glass and masonry. So the great thing about skin and skeleton is it requires less materials than previous techniques. So some of these early skyscrapers were designed by an architect named Louis H. Sullivan. And Louis H. Sullivan, he, he when he designs these, he makes them not only functional buildings, but incredibly beautiful buildings where he has all this ornamental detail on the outside of them. He has he designed a bunch of buildings in Chicago, and recently, sadly, 3 of them have been destroyed. One of them accidentally, and 2 purposely demolished. But these, it's in my eyes, it's a sin to have destroyed these buildings. They should be World Heritage Sites. So the Sullivan's buildings, Jenny's buildings, all these skyscrapers, at the time they're using cast iron for the skeleton part of the building. So even though cast iron doesn't burn as quickly as wood does, it still melts at relatively low temperatures. I mean, it'd have to be a fire, and so it can be dangerous. And this is one of the reasons why they quit using it. Is because in 1911, there was what's known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. So this was a place where these kind of shirts are called shirtwaist. This factory made those shirts. There weren't any fire escapes. There were wooden floors. The boss thought too many people were taking breaks, so he locked the doors during work hours. Somebody probably threw a cigarette or something in a trash can that maybe had paint thinner in it, and then the building caught on fire. People couldn't get out. They were jumping out of the windows. And because of this fire, there were over 146 people died. This is the first skyscraper in Houston. When you do the scavenger hunt, I asked you for early 20th century skyscraper. Don't go for those 50-story skyscrapers. You got to go for this one. It has to be like a skyscraper that's 8 to 10 stories tall. And this is one that's close to school. It's at 201 Main Street. And it probably has a different name now, but it was known as the Lomas and Nelson Building. So I said earlier that the Romans invented concrete. So but theirs was not reinforced. And then during the Middle Ages, we talked about the plagues, the famines, the war, the pestilence, all of that stuff. People died and people forgot how to make it. So people stopped using concrete for a really long time. And then in around 1850, concrete's reintroduced. And then 1870, people start using, more or less 1870, people start using reinforced concrete. The thing about reinforced concrete is it allows for taller buildings. You can make more elaborate structures. It's strong, and it uses less materials than previous techniques. One really famous building that uses reinforced concrete was designed by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who's a student of Louis Sullivan. Unlike Sullivan, he didn't like all these really ornate things on the outside of the building. Instead, he wanted his buildings to blend in with nature. So he believed in unity of design and nature. So this particular house, Falling Water House, he uses these steel reinforced cantilevers. That's a long projecting beam and girder that's only fixed on one end. So these project off the house. And he knew exactly how much steel he wanted into that house. But the contractor was like, he's an idiot. That's not enough. And so he put too much steel in it. And it's makes them too heavy, and so they're like sinking down, and it's caused problems ever since then. Um, there's one house in Houston designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. If you want to buy it, it was 3.5 million. Now it's only 2.5 million. So reinforced concrete allows for houses that have lots of windows and are minimalist style, like this Le Corbusier, who believed that a house should be beautiful and functional as a machine and serve the needs of those who lived in it. This is by Mies van der Rohe, and he has this modern minimalist style where he has very few supports, lots of glass. His homes were nearly transparent. He used neutral colors so they wouldn't compete with nature. His is a famous expression, less is more. Like he felt like the less materials you used in something, the more like amazing and beautiful it would be. And he believed in bringing nature, houses, and human beings together in a higher unity. He designed this at the Museum of Fine Arts, this Cullinan Hall and Brown Pavilion, which has like a ton of windows. So because reinforced concrete can be cast in the molds, it leads to more innovative designs. This sadly is no longer in use and is like in terrible disrepair. But this was made by Eero Saarinen. It's the TWA terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. And it looks like a bird in flight. And even the interior of the building, which is in the chapter, it's almost like you can imagine the flight of a bird taking place in there. Because of reinforced concrete, like buildings can be constructed in almost any form. This is like the Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain. And Frank Gehry, who designed this, did this little scribbly thing. This is my new building. And then this is the building that was a result of that design. These are buildings that are made out of steel and reinforced concrete. This is the Crooked House in Poland that's made out of reinforced concrete. And this thumbprint building is really nowhere. It's an advertisement for a firm that does like, protection for fraud and stuff. And so it's not made out of reinforced concrete. I just put it in there because I like it. So now there's like this increasing need for greener, more energy efficient buildings, and buildings that meet these requirements are certified as LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And these LEED buildings are resource efficient, high performing, healthy, cost efficient buildings. These are some examples of them. This is the Acro building in Fukuoka. I'm sure I said that right, Japan. And this building, in order to keep it cool in the summer and warm in the winter, it has like this terrace that like these plants have been planted on, and it makes the building much more energy efficient. Here's another building in Singapore that has grass growing on it. This is a hotel in the Faroe Islands in the California Academy of Science. And the building 12 at NASA also has plants planted on it. And I don't have this in here, but the Glassell School of Art has a terrace with plants growing on it. It's located at the corner of Montrose and Bissonnette. So now global warming's also affecting designs. And these are, this lily pad is a floating Acropolis for climate refugees, but only if you're a really wealthy climate refugee. The rest of us are, we're just sunk. And then this is an underwater hotel in Key Largo Florida, which I would be scared to death to stay there because I would just keep thinking I was going to break and I was going to drown. And that's it. So that is our last chapter. And I'm so excited about that. And I'm going to stop recording.